Hey everyone, it's Lisa from the blog farmhouseonboone.com, and today I'm going to be sharing my cozy winter dessert menu. Already done a cozy winter menu and a breakfast menu, and I've had some of you reach out and ask if we ever do desserts. We do. We try to limit baking desserts to once or twice a week, but on these cold, long winter days, long in that there's no sunlight, so short, it is one of our favorite activities in the house. So I have one daughter in particular that's always asking if she can bake something, and usually I just refer her to my blog to read some of the recipes. It's a good activity, especially if you can incorporate some of those healthier ingredients to pass some of the long winter days. So we're gonna start with a recipe from the blog, Healthy Date Squares. This one you could double as a breakfast. It's fairly low sugar. Well, it does have healthier sugars, even if it isn't completely low sugar. I'm going to start this by preheating the oven to 350 degrees. Next, I'm just going to use a bit of butter or oil to line the bottom of this baking dish. Now in the blog, I call for an 8x8. This one obviously is not a square, but it's got about the same area. You could also use parchment paper. I'm going to bring to a boil 2 1/4 cups of pitted dates. If you can't find pitted dates, you can always just get some that have pits and then just remove them. I had a few of each kind. A cup of unsweetened apple cider, the juice from 1 orange, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, and the zest from 1 orange. I'm also going to add a pinch of salt and half a teaspoon of baking soda. And then I'm just gonna allow it to boil for about 5 minutes. Just stirring it constantly until the dates all fall apart. All right, well that's cooling. I'm going to add 1 3/4 cups of rolled oats, a cup of spelt flour. Now you could also, of course, just use unbleached all-purpose or whole grain wheat. I like to incorporate this organic sprouted spelt every once in a while, just for a little variation. 1/3 of a cup of coconut sugar. You could also use brown sugar, but I like to use this because it's just a healthier option. 1/2 of a teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 of a teaspoon of sea salt, and then 1 cup of softened butter. I'm going to break these up a little bit just to make it a little bit easier to incorporate. Now it's time to use your best kitchen tools, which are your hands. I use them more often than I care to show. All right, next I'm going to spread half of this mixture into my baking pan. My kids have a few activities. The girls have gymnastics and the boys have swimming lessons, and this is a really good snack to take with you for something like that. It turns into these delicious little bars. Next, I'm going to add my date mixture on top of that. And then I'm just going to cover it with the remaining topping and press lightly. Just going to put this in my 350 degree oven for about 45 minutes. Every recipe that I share today is on the Farmhouse on Boone blog, so if you want to print the recipe out and save it for later, it's all there. And I will link it down in the description box below. All right, the next dessert on the list are my toasted coconut einkorn cookies. These are a staple in our home. Every time my daughter asks to bake, I mean not every time, but most of the time, she's requesting to make cookies because they're easy to whip up. She has the recipe pretty much memorized. And when you add einkorn, it does make them a lot healthier. Now sometimes I have to say, hey, make sure to use einkorn, because if we're gonna be baking on any kind of regular basis, I prefer, of course, for it to be einkorn flour. And with things like bread, it can sometimes be tricky, but cookies, anybody can do it. The kids can make it super simple and forgiving, and I have the recipe on the blog. So we're gonna start by, like we do with any cookie recipe, creaming together the sugars and the butter. For this recipe, it is 1 stick of butter and then a 1/2 cup each of brown and white sugar. Now you could replace this with coconut sugar or with all coconut sugar. I haven't tried honey in this recipe, but that could possibly be an option. You would have to increase the flour to accommodate for all the extra liquids. Next, I'm just gonna add 1 egg and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Okay, to a separate bowl, I'm gonna add 2 cups of einkorn flour. Now we also do use freshly milled. For today's, I'm just using Jovial's all-purpose. It's a buttery yellow color, it's so good. And I'm gonna add a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And then I'm just gonna add it to my mixer with the wet ingredients. And now, the secret ingredient to these cookies, the thing that makes it really good, is toasted coconut. Now this is a simple process. Sometimes I make this just to put on top of yogurt. You can throw it into a bowl of granola. It is just really tasty. So to do it, I'm just gonna add 3/4 cup of shredded coconut to a cast iron skillet, put it on medium heat, stir it constantly. When it starts to brown, I add a tablespoon of honey. As it cools, it gets crispy and so tasty, a perfect addition to any cookie recipe. Just gonna set these aside to cool and get nice and crispy. And then we'll add them into the cookie mixture with the chocolate chips. All right, next I'm just gonna add in the chocolate chips. I love these dark chocolate chunks from Aldi. They're my favorite. Now in the recipe, I say a 1/2 cup, but I have one daughter who says that it is a rule that you do not measure chocolate chips. This is her hard and fast rule. You can't measure chocolate chips. Now I'm going to for this recipe, but feel free to break that rule and follow my daughter's rule in not measuring. After the coconut is nice and crispy, I'm gonna add that as well. One of the really great things about this recipe, if you want your kids to make it or something, is that they can follow it, but it doesn't make a million cookies. It just really makes one full baking sheet, which is always perfect because for me, it's about the activity. We don't really need 4 dozen cookies. And I'm just going to bake them for about 10 minutes at 375 degrees. All right, the next thing we're gonna make is chai ice cream. I love this recipe because it's sweetened with only honey, so it's a good, healthy thing to make. You can use a milk alternative like coconut milk if you are dairy-free. We use goat milk, which is perfect. It comes from our farm. And I love that it's spicy, which makes it a good winter treat. So the way to do it is, first I'm going to crush some chai spices into a mortar and pestle. Now you could also just get a package of chai spices if you don't have nutmeg, cloves, fennel, black pepper, allspice, cinnamon sticks. You can just use a chai spice and then tea bags to actually make it that chai flavor. After I crushed the spices in the mortar and pestle, I added it to 2 cups of whole milk, a cup of heavy cream, 1/3 of a cup of honey. I also zested in 1 orange. And I also added the 2 black tea bags, gave it all a stir, brought it to a light simmer, and then turned off the heat and allowed it to steep for about 10 or 15 minutes to really incorporate all of those delicious chai spices. After the flavor was all nice and incorporated, I strained it through a fine mesh strainer and then added 5 egg yolks. Now I did get interrupted, kids were in and out, and so my mixture had a chance to cool, but if it doesn't and you're making this just right in a row, Make sure to temper your egg yolks by adding your 5 egg yolks and whisking them to some of the really hot cream and then mixing them in. This just allows them to come to temperature without actually cooking. You don't want cooked eggs in there. I just went ahead and whisked mine right in and then added it to my ice cream maker. You can also add it to a 9x13 dish and just freeze it if you don't have an ice cream maker. And enjoy, it's really delicious. All right, the next thing we're going to make is sourdough chocolate rolls. These are just like my sourdough cinnamon rolls, but with a chocolate filling. They're so good, very indulgent, not super healthy except for that the grains are long fermented, but that's about it. But a good treat every once in a while. Now, I actually started this several hours ago to get the long fermentation benefits of the grains. So I mixed a 1/2 cup of sourdough starter with a 1/2 cup of water and 4 cups of flour. You can use unbleached all-purpose. You can use whole wheat if you mill it yourself. Now, if you're going to do einkorn, you're going to need to use less liquid because they'll be really sticky if you use all einkorn. I also added the other liquid ingredients, a 1/2 cup of melted coconut oil and a 1/2 cup of honey. This allows the dough to be wet enough to mix together before adding the rest of the ingredients later. After it ferments for 4 to 12 hours, I did mine for about 6, add in 2 eggs. Now, I like to first incorporate them in with my hands a bit before putting them in the mixer. This just helps them to really get incorporated. It's a little tricky because whenever you ferment a dough and you don't add the eggs till later, it's tricky to get those eggs worked in, but it does work. After the eggs were nice and incorporated, I added in a teaspoon each of baking soda and baking powder and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. To make my filling, I mixed a 1/2 cup of softened butter, a cup of sugar, and a 1/4 cup of dark cocoa. Now, I mixed my chocolate chunks right in, but I would recommend actually going back. It would make more sense to spread the mixture and then add the chocolate later. So roll out the dough. I use a little bit of einkorn flour on my counter. This just helps to not stick, and then einkorn flour is a healthier option if you're going to not long ferment something. Then I just spread it with my chocolate filling, add the chocolate chunks. Roll it up and cut it with thread. Place it in a large cast iron skillet. I have a 14-inch. Drizzle on a 1/2 cup of cream and then just allow it to sit, soak up the cream, rise a little bit before baking at 375 degrees for 25 minutes. The last thing we're going to make for today's cozy winter dessert menu is sourdough cranberry bread. I made myself a cup of afternoon espresso to finish off this job, and kids are definitely threatening to be done with now. Just gonna start by adding 2 1/4 cups of spelt flour. You can also use unbleached all-purpose, a teaspoon each of baking powder and baking soda, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Just gonna give that a little stir and then mix up the wet ingredients. For the wet ingredients, I'm going to mix a 1/2 cup of room temperature butter with a 1/4 cup of tightly packed brown sugar. Once that's all creamed, I'm adding 2 large eggs at room temperature, a 1/2 cup of maple syrup, a 1/2 cup of sourdough starter. And then I'm going to mash up 2 very ripe bananas and add that in, as well as 1/2 cup of orange juice and the zest from 2 to 3 oranges. Now I'm just going to grease my loaf pan, with a little bit of butter, and then slowly add my dry and wet ingredients together. And lastly, I'm going to add in my cranberries. I did 1 1/4 cups of cranberries, and I sliced half of them in half and left half of them whole just to give a little bit of variation. But if you're more interested in a long fermented version, that also is over on the blog in the recipe. So again, there will be a link in the description box for all of these recipes and their printable versions. Now I'm just going to bake this at 350 degrees for about an hour. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed these cozy winter dessert recipes and that you can start incorporating some of these slightly healthier, higher quality ingredients such as spelt flour, einkorn flour, juices, dates, honey, maple syrup, some natural sweeteners. You can really tailor these to make them less of an indulgence, but such a great treat for you and your family this winter to get through some of those cold, dark days. All right, well, as usual, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're brand new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I make 2 new videos every week on food from scratch, natural living, and a handmade home. Thank you so much for stopping by the farmhouse.